This episode is brought to you by Indie Film Hustle TV, the world's first streaming service dedicated to filmmakers, screenwriters, and content creators. Learn more at indiefilmhustle.tv.
Every frame,
No.
So long to render, every frame. And even though they had what they called the Cray computer, which was a thing that looked like a giant sofa.
One of your films you've directed impacted me so much when I was growing up, which is The Last Starfighter. And it is just one of those classic 80s films. I mean, in the pantheon of 80s, I mean, I think it was right smack in the middle. It's like 85, 86, if I'm not mistaken.
84.
84, yes. It was around there, 84, 85, 86. So it was right smack in the middle of the 80s. It's full 80s everything. It's just wonderfully done. The story, the thing that was so wonderful about that story is that I was in 4th or 5th grade at that time. I probably saw it a little bit later on VHS when it came out. But that you are the kid. Because he's just playing a video game. And they're like, wait a minute, I play video games. Wait a minute, this could possibly happen to me. And that was the brilliance of that story. Can you tell me how The Last Starfighter came to be, how you became a part of it, all of that?
Well, it was the script was written by Jonathan Betchwell. Remains a very close friend of mine, great guy, again. Talking about being in the trenches, because when I read the script, the studio, I had done my first film, Tag the Assassination Game, was a little independent picture, and Lorimar saw it and liked the way it looked and thought, young director getting involved with this would be a good match, probably cheaper too.
Obviously.
Yeah. And getting an old veteran. And so I read the script. I thought it needed quite a bit of work, but like you say, the brilliance of the storyline is just, it's so simple and so obvious, especially for that era,
Oh, God, video cards.
Yeah. And John, I know, came up with the idea with it. And he's a New Yorker. He went into a video game parlor, whatever you call those things, and saw people doing this. And then he was reading, I think, some version of Sword in the Stone, the King Arthur myth, that there is someone that's born to be the leader. And he thought, whoa, that's, just clink, came up with. He's like that too. Boy, talk about a guy with, which is the most difficult thing, is that coming up with the creative nugget, the idea that everything circles around that you build on. But he's wonderful like that and very funny too. I think it brought a lot of humor to it. So that's only to say that we spent, I think, almost a year, maybe 8-9 months on the next draft of the screenplay. Mm-hmm. And so we were in a room together, just making the thing work, waiting for them to decide to finally greenlight it. And in the meantime, they had engaged a new kind of technology for this called digital technology. No one had ever heard of. Yeah, someone said they did something in Tron, but that looked like it was.
Yeah, because even Star Wars wasn't digital; it was analog.
Oh
still.
no, that was all analog. It was. Yeah, and those were all models and stuff like that. So this was starting. This had no physical element, So we were in a way stuck because of the good price that digital productions gave for their to do all the visual effects with them, and kind of scarily, they were doing research and development as we were doing the screenplay. So a lot of balls in the air, and a lot of a lot of things that were kind of difficult and crazy. So again, another person in my life that I thought was we'll always have Starfighter together. And then we had a good time. The shoot was pretty easy. The post-production took another year. That was tough.
It's about this. I mean, for people listening, you guys have to understand that the visual effects are in the Last Starfighter is it's a little bit ahead of its time, and you guys were basically in the bleeding edge of technology, emphasis on bleeding. Because I was looking at it, and I was just like, I just recently went back and watched it. I was just like, this is, I mean, I'm a VFX guy. I mean, I've been VFX souping, and I understand how things are done. I'm like, the computer power back then, you're talking 83, 84, and 82, 83. In that world, my God, like, they were still using giant floppy. Like, it wasn't like you could just get things off the shelf. So, it's amazing. And how did you, as a director, even... you shot elements, didn't you? You shot like plates and things for people to comp in and stuff, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, we had the entire picture was storyboarded. I storyboarded even, all the just the live action material that didn't even have visual effects accompanying it. But we had some excellent people on the picture that. Two of which are still, one of which is still a very close friend. Who's the art director was Jim Bissell. Mm-hmm. Jim did E. He did. He just does everythking.
He did okay. He's done okay. He's done okay.
He's done okay. So you had that going for you. Then we had the master, Ron Cobb, who, if you don't know Ron, he was a production designer. He just passed away, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. But he was one of my best friends, and he might as well have been a second director, because he was such a good artist. He could, he came up with all the character art, all the hardware art, all the symbols, everything. He's a master at design, and he was the one that could tell me what I could expect out of what digital productions would be able to do. And here's the upside, here's the downside, here's what we should do. It's why the interior, for instance, of the ship is so simple. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would have liked it to be, Ron was cautioning and going, what, I don't know if they're going to be able to get that kind of complexity into this, so let's go as simple as possible. So those kind of things were used, that information was important to kind of figure out what we were up against. So great team. Gary Allison was a producer, was and the son of the owner of the company, so that helped.
So make sure you had everything you needed.
Yeah, but that wasn't only Gary's strength. He was also very, very good at story too, and has a lot of good ideas. And that was a good team, real good team. And like you say, it's a staple of the 80s. It's something that is always threatening to be either remade or made a sequel.
I've heard rumors for years about it. So do you have any updates on that? Anything going on?
Well, yeah. I mean, back in the early 2000s, John and I had a script with a studio, and it was really very close to getting started, but it just fell apart because of these complicated rights issues, because it turned out to be that two studios had thought they had the claim to the rights, and neither of them would get into partnership with each other. And John had the rights to the characters, and then finally, within the last few years, Jonathan got the rights back because of the age of the project, I think. And now he has another way he thinks he wants to approach it. So there may be some hope for all the Starfighter fans. There may be, in the not too distant future, a new version. And what he has always wanted to do is, no matter how long in between, make it a sequel. So it's not like a reimagining. It's not like and And this was something we wanted to do, almost 20 years ago now, when we wrote it, kind of prefiguring what Star Wars wound up doing their 40 years later thing.
Right.
So I thought we were pretty clever. We came first, even though we
didn't get it produced.
We had it first.
We had it.
Lucas, wherever you are, billions of dollars.
Counting, just count. I picture him in a Scrooge McDuck situation with the gold nuggets. But I mean, they did it with Tron, which is very similar. Like they did that sequel, and I think that was, I loved about the sequel about this. Like they just, brought in the old and brought in the new, and I think that would be an amazing thing to be able to do with The Last Starfighter, like with today's video games and virtual reality. There's virtual reality. There's so many different angles you can go after with it. I wanted to ask you though, as a director, during that time, with being on the bleeding edge of technology, I've had the experience of being on a project where I didn't know if the visual effects were going to come through, and the story depended on certain level. Like if we can't make this VFX work, the movie doesn't work. Right. And that is and it was at the time that I was doing it, it was just like really at the beginnings of off-the-shelf visual effects, meaning like my team that I had, we had the tech, but like no one had really done it on this level on an indie short film, and it was like really high-end stuff, and my guys were all kind of young, which, by the way, they all went off to do like Star Wars and Skyfall, and these guys all turned out to be amazing visual effects artists. But at the time, I was terrified, so I did kind of had a backup plan just in case I could maybe cut that out or cut around it. But did you, at some point, did you just go, man, if this doesn't work, we don't have a movie?
Well, yeah, no, that was always in the back of our. It wasn't just me. Can you imagine the studio?
Right.
That put the 13 or 14, whatever it was, $1 million into the thing. That up, at one point, our visual effects coordinator, Jeff Oken, who did a fantastic job too, by the way, saving our ass a number of times. He did the calculations, and he's, at this rate, this will be done in 5 years. This, they can't sustain it, because every frame, so long to render, every frame, and even though they had what they called the Cray computer, which was a thing that looked like a giant sofa. In fact, it did have something you could sit on, and then all these it looked very, very, very 80s visual effects. It looked
beautiful.
And even though they had that, it really did have the amount of power that's now in my iPhone,
your Apple Watch.
Yeah. It really, and I'm serious.
I know.
Yeah, and so your point is, everyone was nervous about it, and we just had to be creative. Things like that's why I had to be there for a year in post production. I'd be on the in post production at a terminal looking at the thing, and they would go, "Okay, that plane back there, it's never gonna. Is it gonna get any closer than this? Because if it doesn't, we don't have to put all this other information onto it. We can just let it be kind of like a stick figure." And I said, "No, you're good with the stick figures, but every shot, every element, stuff like that, we had to do in order to make it make sense." And then there were things that are the worst. The worst of the effects were their inability to do terrain. Like there's a sequence where the ships go into tunnels.
Forget it.
And they could not at that point get the detail and the smooth out the edges and things like that needed to make it look. And Jeff, he had a whole plan of doing models for that, and came to the production and said, "Okay, we'll fly the digital ship, but we'll do it in models, and it'll look real, as opposed to this." And the production said, "How much is that going to cost?" And he told them, they said, "No, we have this much money. Those guys said they could do it. They're going to do it." So I wound up in the final coloring. Just at some point, I just kept going lower, lower, bring down the
color.
the lighting, so you literally you can see some of those shots you can't even see where you're looking, and it's for good reason. It looks so bad.
That's amazing. So you just kept darkening. It's like, oh. So for everybody listening out there, visual effects are bad. Just darken it just a little bit, Listen, when I was in film school, it was 95, and I was working on a video toaster back in the day.
Right.
And I remember a ship just doing a 3D model of a spaceship and moving it from point A to point B. That was 5 days.
Yeah.
And if it crashed, you start again. So I could only imagine what you guys had to go through. It's insane.
And things weren't invented. For instance, motion blur, which for your audience is like,
right.
Car goes by and you kind of see it in a swish of colors and stuff like that. Well, if a ship went like that against your camera, it would pixelate, because you have to instruct it to have this blur. So they had to invent motion blur for the movie, and they didn't know how to do that.
Yes.
Things that are kind of simple physics in models are not simple physics in the digital world. So, there's a lot of very inventive people. Talk about people in that world that went on to do work, that they all are, master technicians.
Jesus, it's remarkable.
Sometimes your shit isn't that good and someone else makes it better. I mean, that's happened to me once or twice, but that time it was just, but yeah, I was very young. I was like 22, and I pitched them the Punisher idea.
So you made a few films, or you've written a few films during that time that hit me. One of them being you wrote the first Punisher.
Yeah, I did. I mean, it was rewritten by the producer. It would have been a lot better if it hadn't been, but
that's the theme of the show, I hear.
Yeah, well, no, sometimes your shit isn't that good and someone else makes it better. I mean, that's happened to me once or twice, but that time it was just, but yeah, I was very young. I was like 22, and I pitched them the Punisher idea. No one was making superhero movies at that time, in fact. And it got made.
So you actually went in and pitched the Punisher, and then they called up Marvel and said, "Hey, can we get the rights to make?"
Yeah, and remember at the time, Marvel, no one was making Marvel movies. They were making like Captain America and like weird rubber suits.
Oh, it was so bad.
I mean, and it was like so no one was making Marvel movies. Basically, yeah, I pitched the Punisher to this mentor of mine who was a producer as well as a writer, and took it over to New World Pictures, not New World Pictures. And they went for it, and I wrote it. And what was interesting was that a lot of at the time, the concern was it was too comic booky, right? Meaning that like he had a skull on the shirt and all this stuff. So they changed a bunch of that stuff. And then very shortly afterwards, the Batman film that Tim Burton did came out. And sort of or around the same exact time or right afterwards. And it sort of changed the game in terms of what people were willing to do and how they were willing to approach it. But yeah, that was my first produced credit.
So, and that's for people not around at that time, in 1989, which was an amazing year for films, you couldn't walk the street without seeing a bat signal somewhere.
Yes, that's right. It became very, very big.
It was everywhere.
It became very big.
And it's so funny, like, Punisher's a little too comic booky, but because Batman's not comic booky at all.
No, they really went for it with that version of the film, and that kind of opened things up for people a lot.
Yeah, and that's something a lot of screenwriters starting out have to understand is when you are, and even when you're more established, once you sell that script, unless you're a producer and or director on it, the powers you kind of let go. It's like you put it out to sea.
Obviously I've managed to move into directing after some years and all that. But one thing that I always, at the time when I was young and I wrote scripts, I found it very painful to like write something and then have it taken away and completely reworked by somebody else. At this point in my life, when I'm writing a quote unquote studio type film or something like that, it's been years now, I just want to do a draft or two, and then please fire me and take it. And like, you basically know that unless 2 or 3 other people rewrite your script, it's not going to get made.
Right.
So when you're dealing with more personal films, with independent films, that's a completely separate story. Mm-hmm. When you're dealing in the studio system, you do a lot better for your health and mental well-being, understanding that you're part of a factory, that there is zero personal element involved, that you have to just be willing to like do your best as a craftsman and a professional, which doesn't mean you're not doing good work, right? It just means that you're treating it as a craftsman and as a professional, and hope that whatever combination of elements comes together and that they go make it somehow, and that you make some money. But as a young person, you have this dream as a writer, whatever, that somehow your voice is meaningful and that the film's going to reflect what. Forget about it. So, you know, that's definitely a learning experience, I think, that screenwriters go through.
Yeah, because everyone thinks, oh, I'm going to be Sorkin or I'm going to be Tarantino. First script out. I'm like...
Well, but don't forget that Quentin directs his own movies. He's a filmmaker, right? P.T. Anderson directs his own movies. Wes Anderson directs his own movies.
Oh, right. Yeah.
If you're going to be a script writer, it's a whole different story. Maybe Aaron Sorkin, you know, somehow, but, you know, he was also, for the most part, someone who did television, right? I mean, he did a few features, right? But his real kind of claim to fame is television, and in television, the writer's king, which is very different than feature films. That is a different world. When we talk about TV, and now TV is much bigger, right? Like Netflix, like the writer and the writer's room and the executive producer is a different story. In movies, the writer is not in the same position as the writer is in television.
And it's all about experience. You know, I'm no genius. And I sat with my crew, with Bob and Bruno and Alex. We set a style for each film that worked for that film.
In my opinion, a decade-defining film, which is Wall Street. It really captures a segment of what the 80s were like, for people who wanted to kind of feel what it was like to be there at that time. And I feel that that's something that you do with a lot of your films. You define the era so beautifully, like with The Doors and JFK.
I just set out to tell the story in the best style I could. I was able to get better and better at filmmaking, and it's all about experience. You know, I'm no genius. And I sat with my crew, with Bob and Bruno and Alex. We set a style for each film that worked for that film. In other words, JFK was done in a very specific style for that story, as was Natural Born Killers. And so was, and Wall Street was done this way. Born on the 4th of July was very, very hard and almost cinemascope vision of reality, linear story. We made it linear. The book was not. Mm-hmm. So each film, I was never thinking about, I was just defining something. I think a lot of my work since then has also defined for me new things, but if people don't see it yet, they will one day. I've gotten more and more into documentaries. I've done 9 or 10 now, 8 or 9, including the Untold History of the United States is, I think, one of my strongest efforts. It was done in 2012, and it was 12 hours long. It was the history of untold history of this country from 1898 to 2012 with Mr. Obama. Please see it. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it.
I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it.
You have seen it?
Yeah, I saw it when it came out back in the day, and I
see it again.
Yeah, I know. I saw it's.
You got to pay attention.
No, it's absolutely. Now, when you were making Wall Street, you worked at the Paris Mercantile Exchange when you were a teenager? Is that correct?
How'd you know that?
Well, I do a little bit of research. And is that one of the things that kind of drew you to that story? What made you make Wall Street? Because there's so much passion behind there.
Yeah, I worked on the Cocoa and Sugar Exchange in Paris one summer. Yeah. And my father was on Wall Street for most of his life, from 1930s on, 1932, 3, right. 4, in that area. No, at 4 he became He was a floor walker in the Depression, and then he became a stockbroker, an analyst. He worked his way up. It was the old system. He was the Hal Holbrook character in a sense, or the Marty Sheen character from Wall Street. He was the old-fashioned value. It was the way, do it the right way. Wall Street for him was a serious religion. It was the engine of American business. And I mean, he meant it seriously, because Wall Street was where you would go to get money. You would go to capitalize your business for research and for capitalization. I mean, it's very important to build companies. It was his idea of America. It was building. And he saw Wall Street as a most positive factor, which I believe it was for many people. Although obviously there's some privilege and abuse. Some people take advantage of it to more. But my father was a good man, and I don't think money was not his goal. It was about he was an intellectual. He wrote monthly letters, so he really cared about this. If he had lived past 85, he would have been, I think, surprised to see a Gordon Gekko type. When I made the movie, the business was changing. I had friends who were making millions of dollars at my age, on Wall Street. Well, actually, at that time I was actually 43. So I'm saying people were making money in their 30s, some in their late 20s. This was unheard of in my father's day.
Oh, right.
Now, and of course, it was revealed. A new business was revealed. The concept of businessmen like Gekko going into companies and getting their stockholders to vote for them, and breaking up these companies, and in some cases cannibalizing them. That is to say, taking businesses like big business and take a subsection of it and sell it off, cannibalize it. That's what he does in the movie. Charlie Sheen's father is a union rep at the airline. He runs the union on a tip from Charlie that was given to him. He takes advantage of the naivete of Charlie. Michael Douglas does, and he buys into the company. It's one of his many things he's doing. He buys into the company and eventually gets control of it, and then breaks it up, destroying so many jobs. And I showed that, the pain of that, and I think that's important. And the father feels betrayed by the son. The father has a heart attack. The son understands the scope of his mistake, which is huge. So many people get hurt. Mm-hmm. And all his life, in other words, he repents. He gets to this. You'll see what happens in the movie. He changes, and he goes after Gekko, reveals him to the SEC, and takes the fall. He himself takes the fall. He gets involved. He gets to go to jail, and presumably he's learned his lesson and comes out of jail, and he'll be a good man, a better man. That's a true story. It happened a lot. But the surprise of the movie, of course, was that, first of all, they didn't want to make that either, because who cares about business? There were not many business movies before that were serious. Mm-hmm. This was, and they distributed it very weirdly. It's a whole story I write about in the next book. Mm-hmm. But it actually hung around, and it made money over time. It became a big cult favorite. And more than that, it became as you say, it affected a lot of young people who went into Wall Street. Some of them I've met since then. Some of them made fortunes on Wall Street. They owe me
a small commission.
In a way, I was my father's continuation, because he was a broker, made money for people, not himself. But the shock was that Michael Douglas, who was the supporting character, the bad guy, so to speak, becomes the star of the movie in people's minds, and of course wins the Oscar.
I know.
The film doesn't get nominated for anything, not even for screenplay. And there are many witty lines in it, but no, it went to Michael, and Charlie went his own way in his own career, and I think he was a talented young actor. Mm-hmm. But you know where he went. He went into girls and money. But he was the first part of the film. I don't think he was the second part.
Fair enough.
But I knew it had to be an expanded version of Proof. So I had to write a movie backwards. I had to. Right. How do I take this one sequence and make an entire feature around it?
Your first feature, Fanango, you hired a little unknown actor at that time. I think Kevin something or other. I don't even know if he's doing anything anymore. Mr. Costner, Kevin Costner, you hired him, and he actually has become in your career a collaborator for a lot of big films that you worked on. How was it working with like putting Fandango together? And because I remember watching Fandango, there's such a youthful energy. It's created by young filmmakers, acted by young filmmakers, and you can sense that energy there. How was it like putting that whole thing together, and also having Big Daddy Spielberg like in the shadows? Must have been terrifying.
It was an interesting experience. I mean, it was just kind of handed to me. Okay, go make this movie, but I knew it had to be an expanded version of Proof. So I had to write a movie backwards. I had to.
Right.
How do I take this one sequence and make an entire feature around it? And I mean, unfortunately, I think Steven expected it to be more like Animal House, which is sort of the quality, a little bit of Proof. But I guess at the time I wanted to do something a little more soulful. And like so many filmmakers, it was that sort of, my first film was that sort of quintessential coming of age story that everybody has to get out of their system before they can move on to something else. And that's sort of where I found myself as I sat down to write it. And I think it was more soulful, which I don't think was a bad thing, but I think it was not necessarily what some people expected it to be. And as for Costner, I actually met him when I was in film school, because when I was making Proof, he came in and read for the part in the student film. He was the stage manager at Raleigh Studios in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. He was sweeping floors trying to get gigs as an actor, and he came in and read for the part, and I really liked him, but I cast somebody else, as you can see in Proof. But I called him and I said, look, man, I'm sorry. I thought you were great. I really liked you, but I don't know why. I've cast this other guy. And he was, very gracious and thanked me and all. And then like a couple years later, when we were actually making Fandango and casting it, he came in again to read for it. And we remembered each other and we talked, and, I remembered him very well. And he sat down to read for the part of Gardner Barnes, and literally within the first two lines out of his mouth, I knew he was the guy. And
did he switch? Did he switch something from 2 years earlier? What made the difference?
I don't know what it was. It was just, I don't know if in those couple of years, he'd done a couple of smaller parts. He was, cutting the Big Chill and stuff. But
he was if I remember correctly, he was a dancing extra in Night Shift, Ron Howard's Night Shift.
He was. But there was just, he had the quality of the character. And I think it was more, he had the quality of the character in the expanded version, because Gardner Barnes in Fandango is a much more complete character with a much deeper arc than the character in the short. And maybe that's what it was that the character himself had changed a lot in those 2 years, and he just fit him. And that's when I cast him.